Hello, this is Carl Irwin with a Blender tutorial. This is going to be kind of a departure from the series that I've been working on concerning quick rendering assets. I just did a commentary on the Blender PBR branch, that is the physical based rendering within the viewport branch that's currently in development. As I was thinking about that, and also thinking about the last asset tutorial that I did, in which I performed a little bit of color grading and demonstrated a few tricks for final compositing and polish, I was thinking about the idea of motion blur and applying motion blur to a render that does not have it. That is a rendered pass that has no samples, multi-sampling on it. So now there are programs that can do that, and there's actually a number of add-ons that go with other well-known compositors that can approximate and interpolate new frames based on the analysis of before and after frames to generate kind of a motion blur effect without having multiple samples. I've played around with a couple of those. One that is made for Linux is one called Slow-Mo Video. And I found that I've been completely unable to get that to work in an acceptable way at all. So I've given up on that. And you may have seen my tutorials in the past where I look at the idea of doing what I call the poor man's motion blur. That is, where you take either a single sampled output and then you generate kind of interpolated frames to convey the essence of motion blur, or you oversample intentionally in your render your render output so that you have twice as many frames that you can then kind of create this staggered motion blur effect, and then time it after you've done that to add a couple of samples in there. So I've done that before, and that has some limited results. There's only so far that you can take that kind of a technique, and it doesn't necessarily give you the very best results. It kind of gives you only mildly acceptable results. So what I want to look at here is an idea that I came up with based on the last tutorial that I did where we were touching on compositing techniques, and we were looking at the idea of sharpening an image from inside the Blender video sequence editor using what's called a high-pass filter. And this is a technique that's been used in photo editors and other compositors for a long time. And I was just applying it to the video sequence editor using a couple of tricks. And I got to thinking about this, that if you can isolate the highlights and then the shadows of a render of a frame using a high-pass filter, it seems to me that you could use a similar technique to indicate velocity. That is, where portions of an image are moving quicker, or items within an image are moving quicker than others. So this is a motion blur render. If you look at this, there's three objects in the scene here. And by the way, this is PBR rendered. This is a viewport render, OpenGL rendered using approximated world-based reflections and lighting, and also some OpenGL light sources as well. So it also is using the screen space ambient occlusion and also the depth of field. So we'll look at the scene here in a second. But this is a render that has only a single sample. There is not multiple samples here in the render. Yet if you look close, you'll see these parts that are moving quickly. They have what appears to be a multi-sampled motion blur applied to it. And this is all using a filtering process that I'm going to show you in a moment here. And I think it's fairly passable. This looks, relatively good. It might be a little bit exaggerated on purpose for the purposes of the tutorial. But you can see that as the objects are moving at high velocity, we have motion blur. And then if you look at this green monkey head here, it comes to rest, and you can see as we keep scrubbing through the scene, these other parts that are moving at a high velocity, they maintain motion blur. Yet this part that's at rest is crisp and clear. It's not blurry around the edges. It's a HD resolution image, and there's no extra artifacts on there. So how is this done? Well, let's take a look here. First, I want to examine the methods by which we can do this using other processes that I've used in the past, the poor man's processes. And actually, before I do that, just let me show you the scene real quick. So just quickly to talk big on the PBR port branch. You can see here that this is all within the viewport. We have the screen space ambient occlusion, we have depth of field, and then all of the nodal materials are set up using if we scroll out here, there's a equirectangular applied world map, and that is affecting the lighting. Plus we have a couple of OpenGL lights in there, 2-point lights to give us this final output. So all pretty cool. Now I found out one thing about this, just kind of as a side note. The screen space ambient occlusion, even when you have the sample set very high, I have them up to 200 here, and I have a fairly fast machine. Even when you have that, you probably want to render at a very high resolution. So what I do, because this renders pretty quick anyway, this is 1 frame here, so about a second. What I do is I set the HD resolution output not to 100 but to 120. Then I render one pass, and then I take that pass, I throw it into the VSE, and then I render it out again at 100% back to the regular HD. And it just helps to smooth out some of that, some of those issues that you can have with the screen space ambient occlusion. So just a little trick that I do on my machine. You can just kind of deal with some of those artifacts. It's not really that big of a deal, but if you want to clean them up, you can just render at a higher percentage. You can actually go past 100% on the resolution and render that out. So anyway, this is the scene that we are originating from. Let's go back to the viewport or the video editor real quick. And let's open up a new scene. So a new video editor, and we'll set this to 100%. And let's import the original output here. So this is the regular pass without any motion blur on it. So you can see that everything is moving through the scene. There's no motion blur at all. It is single sampled output. Okay, so this is the regular output, and you can see our objects moving through the scene. Now, one of the ways that you can apply a poor man's motion blur is I could have sampled this at 2 or 3 or 4 times the sample rate, which would take 2 or 3 or 4 times much more time to render it out, and then I'd have to composite that together and then re-render. Or I can just take this output, and if I duplicate it, slide it up, and I'll move it over 1 frame, and let's say I set the opacity to 0.1. So it's at 10% opacity, and then I'll duplicate this again, and I'll move it over to frame number 2. So I've got 1 frame ahead at 10%. Now I've got a frame past, and say we'll set this at, I don't know, we'll go big, 30%, so 0.3. And then I'll do one more, and I'll set this one to, we'll cut that in half, 0.15. So you can see I've applied this kind of a poor man's motion blur. Now, there's a few problems with this. First of all, you can see the very sharp edges between all of these samples. Okay, so it's not it's not that great. It gives the essence of blur because we get the interpolated frames, but at the same time we're seeing very sharp edges. There's only 3 samples here. The second problem is that the samples pass. They go past the point of motion. So if I go frame by frame, this blur is extending past the distance of motion because it's extending 2 frames in one direction and 1 frame in the other. So this doesn't work all that great. You could do that. Now, another way to deal with it might be to take these and just lower them a whole lot more. So maybe I set this one to 0.075, and then I'll set the next one maybe to a 0.15, and then the next one we'll set that to 0.075. So we're really low now on our transparency, our opacity, and you can still kind of see the essence of blur, and this makes it a lot better. It is still past the point of motion, but you don't really notice that, at least not in most of the areas. So this passes pretty well. However, the image is still pretty sharp now because we've taken our opacity way down. So, these are the problems you deal with when trying this method of adding motion blur. It doesn't really work all that well. It's really kind of a cheap trick. Now, I came up with this way that we can use this high-pass filter idea to mask out the edges, and just the edges where there is high velocity. And then on top of that, we can apply a blurred image. Now, one way we could try to apply this is maybe to use as our samples a blurred version of the original. And that works really well. That actually produces some pretty good results using this process until you get to a place where an object has become stationary and there's no more motion blur applied to it. What you end up with is a very hazy outline because you've got multiple samples of that same image that are blurred beyond the original resolution. So that doesn't work. What if we could use this high-pass filter to show only the parts that are moving, and then when parts are no longer moving, there's no longer any velocity in the scene, we can take the mask away and we have the high definition again, high resolution. So let's see if we can try to mimic that. Let's get rid of these. And we're going to use we're still going to use some good old hacking the viewport tricks here. So we'll go back to some of our old tricks in the bag. We're going to take the resolution down to 25% because it just doesn't need to be very high to create the mask that we need to. We're going to add to this a Gaussian blur. So this is the original output. Make sure we select it first. Add a Gaussian blur. And we're going to set this to 4 pixel blur. Now, because we're at 25%, 4 pixels goes a long way. We get a pretty, fairly blurred out image here. And that actually might be too high. Maybe we want to go more to 2 pixel motion blur. What's that look there? 2 pixel blur. That might be a little bit more accessible. I'm not sure. Let's go to 3. We'll kind of split the difference here. Trying to remember what I did originally. Let's go back to the original scene here. So my original blur was 4. Well, let's do that. Okay, so we'll go back down here. You'll have to play with this, and it won't always be the same. So there's a little bit of artistic license in this. So 4 pixel motion blur, and what we're going to do is we're going to render this out. So we'll render this to a new file. We'll go to AVI JPEG. We'll go to our folder here. We're going to render this as the blur pass, HD blur pass. We'll hit accept, and we will render this out very quickly. So this will render very fast because we're rendering at a low resolution, and my machine is fairly quick as well. So that's it. So this is already going a lot faster than it would be if we were trying to use a third-party plugin or a third-party application to do interpolation, or if we were trying to oversample our OpenGL output. So if you were to remove all of my talking and jabbering here, you could see that just applying this would be a very quick process. So that's the first part. Let's now import this. We're going to add our blurred movie now. So our output was the blur pass. This is what we just created, okay? And we'll go now to our image here. Okay, so there's the blurred pass that we made. Now we will take this, and we're going to generate our poor man's motion blur using the blurred version of this. Okay, so we'll set this opacity. We're going to set it really high to 20%. So we're going to overdo this quite a bit. We'll move this over to frame 2. We're going to set this to 0.4, so 40%. And then we'll set another one here to 0.2, so 20%. So what this is it is a super oversampled motion blur using an already blurred version. Okay, we're going to render this out again. So we're going to call this, we'll call this our, I'll go back to the list here. I'm trying to remember what I call this, the blur composite. So this is a composite blur. It has a motion blur in it, but it's all composited together based on our original blur. We're still going to render at 25% to keep this nice and quick. And we'll render this out. You'll see how fast this renders. This renders it incredibly fast because there's no effect being applied to it. So now that we've got that, let's bring that back in. So we will bring in our that movie that we just made, our composite blur. And then we're going to bring in we'll bring in the original blurred output as well, so the blur pass. So we've got the blur pass here, and then we've got the composite blur underneath. Go back to here. So this is the composite blur, and then this is the blur pass. See how that works, okay? Now we're going to generate from this a high pass filter. But because the image that we are reducing from is not exactly the same as the original, so the original here is the one that doesn't have the composite blur to it, the poor man's motion blur apply. It has this one. We're going to reduce, instead of reducing a sharp image from a blurred image like we did for the sharpen effect in the last tutorial, we're going to reduce this image from the composite blur. Okay, see what we come up with. So we want to get a black and white mask type image. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the first image down here. We're going to turn the saturation to 0. So it's a black and white image. Then I'm going to add a curves adjustment, and then I'm going to invert it. So I'm going to take the blacks and move them up, take the whites, move them down. So it's the exact opposite. Then we're going to go to this blur pass that we made, this first one. Again, I'm doing a lot of talking here. This would happen a lot quicker if I wasn't talking and explaining. We're going to take this saturation all the way down, but this is not inverted. Okay, so here's what we've got. We have the blur pass is regular but no saturation, and then the composite blur is inverted with no saturation. Now what we're going to do is we're going to take the blur pass and we're going to set the cross opacity to 0.5. And what it does, because it's inverted, is it takes all of the color and turns it to an absolute neutral gray, except for the parts that are part of the composite blur. So you see the lighter parts are actually the areas, actually the light and dark parts, are the areas that are being, that are part of that motion blur. It's the areas that are happening after the objects are moving through the scene. And you'll notice that once this green one here, this is the green monkey head, once it comes to rest, watch what happens. It completely disappears because it's not moving anymore. You see that? It just isn't, there's no more velocity to that. Now you see this little piece sweeping through. That's the shadow of the other moving object, which would have to have a motion blur applied to it as well. Okay, so you see where there's velocity, there's a mask. Okay, so you can follow what I'm talking about here. Let's take these two parts. We're going to make a metastrip, and then from this metastrip, we're going to make a transform, just like we did in the last tutorial. We're going to duplicate this transform. Let's turn off the top one. We're going to take the bottom one, and we want to take the light parts for this one. And we're going to make those stand out. So we're going to create a contrast curve here. Let's add a curves adjustment. We're going to take the black section, which is going to represent the darks and the neutral gray, and we're going to move it on the x-axis over to 0.5. So we're going to slide this in and crunch down onto the whites. Okay, you see how that happened. Let's go up to the top one here. We're going to take this one here, turn it on, and we're going to apply a curves adjustment. We're going to invert it. We're going to take the blacks, because we want to take the dark colors, the parts that are darker than neutral gray, and we're going to make those white. And we're going to take the parts that were white and neutral gray and make those black. So we'll invert it, and then we'll take the part that represents the black, and we'll move it on the x-axis again to 0.5. That'll crunch in the neutral gray and leave out the lighter colors here. Okay. Now we're going to take the top layer and we're going to apply this as an add. So we have now the parts that are black and white in our high pass filter are now all white on top of black. And they represent the moving parts, the parts that have high velocity. Okay. So this is what we have. Now, on top of this, let's take these parts here. We're going to make all of this a metastrip. And then we're going to turn up the, let's see here, we're going to turn up the multiply value to a very high amount, we'll say 4. So we're going to take this mask, and you see it's really blocky and chunky, and that's okay because this isn't going to stand in for very much in terms of the way that it masks. And we're going to kind of smooth this over just a little bit. But this is what we have in the end. Let's take, and you can see, here's the green monkey coming in for a landing, and as soon as it lands, it disappears. There's no more mask there, but all the other parts that are still high velocity are moving. Let's add to this a Gaussian blur just to smooth it over a little bit. A lot of artistic license here again. And we're going to set the amount to just a couple of pixels again. So here we've got our final output. And I do believe that's what my settings were in the original scene. Let's go back here. So here's my Gaussian blur applied there. Actually, it was 4, so let's go back and do that again. Set a little bit higher to 4 pixels. And again, you can play around with this and see what works for you. All right, so here's my mask that I'm making. And let's render this out. We're going to call this the blur mask. Okay, so we'll hit accept, and then we'll render that out. And again, it's rendering at 25%, so it renders incredibly quickly. It's very low resolution. Very blurry too, and that's okay for what we're going to use it for. So there we go. We have our final output, and let's then add back to this our movie, our original movie. So this is the original flat pass, and we'll set our opacity back up high again. And go back here to the video sequence editor. There we go. So this is our original film, original footage. Now, we're going to do something. We're going to kind of split the difference between the poor man's motion blur technique and then this mask. I found that the mask alone doesn't quite do it justice, that you kind of need to do both things. So what we're going to do is we're going to apply our original poor man's motion blur just with a single sample at a very low rate. And then we're going to use the masked layer to cover up those sharp edges and smooth everything out. So we're going to take this original and we'll apply another instance of it. We'll move it over 1 frame to 0. We'll set the opacity very low, 0.075. And then we're going to add another instance of this. We'll slide it up, move it over to frame 2. We'll set the opacity to 0.15. And then we're going to apply another instance of this, move it over to frame number 3, and we'll set this to 0.075. So now we have our poor man's motion blur applied. We can still see some of the sharp edges in there, but we do have the essence of blur going on. Okay, now on top of this, we're going to add another movie. We're going to add our original blur pass. So this is the original one that we made at 25% with the 4 pixel motion blur. You see that it's up converted to 100%, and it gets rid of a lot of that blockiness, which is one of the reasons why we're able to get away with that low resolution, is that the up conversion in Blender VSE is actually quite good. So we'll apply this, and then we're going to add on top of that our mask. So we'll add another movie, and we'll grab the blur mask that we made. So this is the move this over to the frame 1. So this is the mask that we came up with, and again, it just covers those parts that are of high velocity. Everything that's not moving goes to black, or mostly black. Let's turn off the opacity on that. We're going to rename this very quickly just so we can pick it out in our lineup. We're going to call this our mask pass. We're going to go to our blurred output, the blur pass, and we're going to add a couple of things to this. We'll add a curves adjustment just in case we need to adjust the color a little bit. And then below that, we're going to add the mask itself. And then for the mask, we're going to have it set to strip, and we're going to select that mask pass. And you can see here it's set to cross, so we can kind of see what it's doing. It is applying the mask, those light colors, from the mask onto our blurred pass here. Let's take our blur mask. I'm going to select it. It's already muted. And I'm going to set the multiply value up really high. Let's set it up to 4. And then we have to hit refresh sequencer so we can see it. So you can see now it's really showing up. Let's set our blur pass output, instead of being set to cross, we'll set it to alpha over. So we're using that mask to then apply an alpha transparent overlay of our blurred version on top of our high resolution version that has our poor man's motion blur applied to it. So you see we've got the best of every world. When this green monkey head comes to rest, you can see it's got HD high resolution definition. Yet up here on this one that's still moving, we now have a smooth motion blur. And you can see how this works. If I take my blur pass, which has the mask applied to it, and I turn it off, you can then see kind of a sharpness of the original plate underneath, and then you can see the edges more clearly of our poor man's motion blur. Over here on the blue one, you can really see it right here pretty clearly. Then if I take my blur pass and I turn it back on, you can see that it instantly smooths that out. I mean, that's pretty remarkable. Look at that. Let me turn it off again. So this is without. And then if I turn it on, this is with. So what I've done is I've created an overlay that is overlaying a blurred image that has a poor man's motion blurred to it, and it is blurred, but it's only masking the points of high velocity. And it's smoothing out just the edges of my otherwise cheap poor man's motion blur underneath. Now, this is still oversampled beyond the actual motion of the objects, but it's really, really low. I mean, the amount of blur that we're applying is of such a low value, and the fact that we're smoothing out those edges, it's really difficult to tell that we're slightly oversampled. This is a pretty good solution, I think. So if you did, remove all of my talking here and just a look at how quickly I was able to render those passes, if you understand the logic of what I've done, you can see how this would be a pretty efficient way to generate motion blur on a render that otherwise has nothing, doesn't have a motion blur applied to it, and doesn't have more than just the one sample. So just an idea there. It just kind of popped in my head earlier today, and I came home after work and played around with this a bit and was able to come up with this result. So I'm going to do a little bit more of an investigating with this and try to apply it to some of my projects and see how far I can take this. But it's a pretty decent post-processing trick, I think, here to generate motion blur where you otherwise don't have it. You could also maybe even apply this to video that you take that has a very fast shutter speed. And if you want to apply motion blur, for example, let's say you are shooting green screen and you shoot your green screen plate, but your green screen plate you set with a high shutter speed so that you can get a very clean, clear matte. And once you've done that, you've composited that together with your back plate. Then you can take that final render and apply this post-processing trick. And you can then add the essence of motion blur on top of that to make everything kind of sit together nice and clean, to get rid of those edges from your green screen compositing. So, you know, there's a lot of really interesting applications that you could use this for. With respect to post-processing motion blur when you otherwise don't have it, without using a third-party plugin and without having to oversample your render output, especially when you can't, such as with a green screen or video, and without using some other compositor that has a plugin that's very resource intensive. So anyway, hopefully you find a good use for this, and you find this useful in your projects, and I wish all of you again, happy blending.